Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Bava Basra Daf Kuf Ayin Daled 174, but we're going to start on 173b around at the two dots around 10 lines on the bottom. So our Mishnah had said that if a person says, I'll be your guarantor on the condition, Im Amar Al Manasha Para Mimisha Eretz, he says, I'll lend you money by condition I can take the money from whoever I want, meaning say I can take from the guarantor. So then he can, whereas Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, no, you can't. Ben kach, or you permanent, you can't take from the guarantor. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan taught, Lo Shanu, when do we allow you to take money from the guarantor directly? The Arev. We're going to have two different words for the guarantor. One is an Arev, one is a Kabbalah. When do we allow you to take from the guarantor? Only only when the borrower has no assets. If the borrower has assets, then you can't take from the guarantor. Then you can't take from the arev. Gemara says, but what about the next clause? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, the next clause says that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says if the arev has assets, you can't. If the borrower has assets, you can't take from the arev. Doesn't this imply? We call it Tanakama Savar. That Tanakama implies that you could take whether or not the borrower has assets, you could take from the Arev. So that's difficult with Rabbi Yochanan's reading. So therefore, the Gemara says, the text was missing some words. We have to fill it in. This is what the Mishnah means to say. If you use what's called an Arev and you lend your money to your friend and there's an Arev, a guarantor, you can't take directly from the Arev. Meaning to say, under those circumstances, the Arev is just promising to produce the person who borrowed the money, but he's not promising to pay. But if he says, I can take money wherever I want from the Paramina Arev, you could take from the guarantor. But remember, when do we say you could take the money from the Arev? Is this still the Tanakama's position? When the borrower himself has no assets. But if the borrower has assets, then you can't take from the guarantor. So if the borrower has assets, you have to go to the borrower. If the borrower has no assets, you go to the guarantor. That's the position of the Tanakama as explained according to Rabbi Yochanan. But then there's another type of guarantor called the Kabbalah. And this Kabbalah, even though the guarantor, even though the borrower has assets, you go straight to the Arev Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is a higher level of a guarantor. He says you can come to me first and collect the money. And Shimon Gamliel Omer on the top of 174a, he says, he says, no, if the borrower has assets, even if it's an Arev Kabbalah, you go straight to the borrower and not to the guarantor. So wherever Rabbi Shimon Gamliel taught halacha in our Mishnah, now we're going to say halacha kamosa. Then the halacha is like him. Puts me Erev Tzidon v'Rayach Rona, except for the case of the Arev, which is this guarantor. Tzidon, a case in Gittin, and Rayach Rona, a case which, as Hashem Yisparach will get to in Sanhedrin, in the third parak of Sanhedrin, parak Zeburer in Sanhedrin. So those are the three cases where in the Mishnah the law is like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Amar Rav Huna Halveo. So now we're going to see what's the difference between the language used between whether it's a guarantor or it's an Arev or a Kabbalah. Again, an Arev is somebody who is saying if the borrower can't pay, I'll pay, and a Kabbalah is somebody who's saying I'll pay right away. So how do we draw the distinction in the language? So it says Rav Huna. Halvel vani arev, halvel vani pareya, halvel vani chayav, halvel vani etain, kun lashon arev. Wherever he says lend him and then I'll pay, lend him, and I'll give you the money. All of these are a question of arevus, of a guarantee. But since you're lending him the money, he has to pay first. But teinu, give it to him, vani kablan, teinu vani pareya, give it to him, and I'll pay. Teinu vani chayav, give it to him, and I owe the money. Teinu vani etain. That's an expression. Since you're not saying lend it to him, you're saying give it to him. You're basically saying I'm going to be responsible to pay first. That's the expression of kabbalas. Kulash and kabbalas saying. The Gemara says, well, what about some ambiguous language? Yibalu helveo vani kablan teinu vani arev. Lend him the money, and I'll be the kablan. So it's contradictory in terms. It should be teinu vani kablan or helveo vani arev. Or if he says teinu vani arev, again, the contradictory terms. What will be the law? My Amar Yitzchak. Lashon arevos, arevos, lashon kabonos, kabonos. Rabbi Yitzchak says, use an expression of arevos, that's arevos, expression of kabonos, that's kabonos. So then the Gemara says, Rav Chisda Amar Kuan lashon kabonos, saying, no, in all these cases, and it's an expression of kabonos, unless you use the word bar mev alveo vani arev, meaning say the assumption is it's that you're a kabbalah unless you say both terms, lend him and I'll be the arev, halveo vani arev. Whereas Rava says it's just the opposite. Kuan lashon areva, same. Everything is that we assume you're an arev. Bar mitenlo vani nosin, except if he says give it to him and then I'll give, which is the double expression, which is the lesson of kabbalas. So if he says give it to him and then I'll give you the money, then the lender can't even go back to the borrower at all. It's all the kabbalah, because he's saying you give him the money, and it's like you're my agent to give him the money, and now you owe me, I owe you the money. So the Gemara says, that we say no, it's not the case. The borrower is not going to be exempt from the lender unless unless we're talking about a case unless the guarantor himself takes the money and directly gives it to the borrower. But other than that, we're going to say that that the borrower always has to pay. So now the Gemara says, Ahu Dayana, we have some cases. Ahu Dayana, there was a judge. Da'achte, hold on. So the case is Ahu Dayana, there was a judge. Da'achte u'malve u'nirse. And he put the lender directly into the possessions of the borrower, before the lender even brought the borrower to the court. So Stalke Rav Chanin Bered Rav Yeba. Rav Chanin Bered Rav Yeba removed the lender. He said this judge didn't do the right thing. Some Rishonim even say that he removed the judge. But most say Rashbam, he removed the lender from the possessions of the borrower. He said, so look how smart Rav Chanin Bered Rav Yeba is. He loved Rav Chanin Bered Rav Yeba. Why? Because he says that, well, how do we understand this? The possessions of a person, they are like they're like a guarantor. The possessions are your there, or maybe there is his guarantor. And so therefore, just like you can't go to the guarantor before going to the borrower, so too can't go to the possessions before going to the borrower. You first have to go straight to the borrower. It means you can't go to the guarantor first. So too, you can't go to the possessions until you actually bring the borrower into the court. So there was a guarantor for orphans, the and he paid off the loan before telling the orphans that what he was doing. So Rav Papa says, no, this is the problem. Why? Priyas b'chov mitzvah. The paying off of a debt is not an obligation, but it's a mitzvah. I mean, to say it's a good thing to do, but you're not obligated. You don't have a chiyuv. And so therefore, since the way Rashbam explains it, so since the orphans are less than 13, they're not obligated to do mitzvos. And so therefore, when they get older, therefore he could bring them to court when they get older. That's how Rashbam understands it. So he can't collect the money from them now. Not everybody takes this approach, but that's Rashbam's approach. So Priyas B'chov is a mitzvah. So they have to do it when they get 13, but until then they don't have to do it. What's the mitzvah? Rashi and Suvo says that it's based upon the idea that it says in the pasuk in Vayikra in Kedoshim, Hin tzedek yelochem, and the Chum say hin. The words of hin, meaning to say, when you say yes, you have to pay off your debt. Rabuna Breda of Yeshua says no. It's Amar Mimar Tzrari Atfase. Maybe their father already paid off the debt, and you didn't know. What do you mean Tzrari Atfase? It means like maybe he gave him the equivalent of the money, like bundles of like metals and stuff, and so therefore he didn't actually pay the debt, but he collateralized the debt, and so therefore maybe the lender is holding on to it, and so. Meaning to say, maybe the father gave the money to the lender so that he couldn't go to the guarantor, and so therefore, uh, uh, we have to assume that perhaps the debt was paid off, and so the lender shouldn't have paid it yet. So therefore, the orphans don't have to pay. So the Gemara says, "In my benayah, we're on top of 174b. What's the distinction between Rav Huna Breda of Yeshua and Rav Papa? The distinction is Ika benayah kishachiyav moda. When the person who owes the money, the when he's dying, he admits that he owes the money, and then we don't have to be concerned about Rav Huna Breda of Yeshua's answer, and then the orphans have to pay, but we still have to be, according to Rav Papa, they still wouldn't pay. Inami deshamtu meis b'shimta, or we know for a fact he didn't pay because we excommunicated him and he died while they still excommunicated him for not paying. Shalcham Nisam, so then they sent a message, Shamtu Meis B'Shemte. So they sent a message from there that if they excommunicate him and he dies in his excommunication, so meaning to say, we know for a fact he hasn't paid, Helchas HaKarafuna Breder of Yeshua. Then we're going to say that the orphans have to pay back because the assumption is that their father didn't pay. Meitzvei, but we have a contradiction for this. If there's a guarantor who he has a note against the estate, Eino Gova. So then, so the guarantor is making a claim against the orphans, and he says, "I paid this debt of your father," and this document proves that because he returned to me the loan, and so therefore, clearly, you have to pay me. So we see from here, there's a contradiction because clearly it wasn't paid, but we still say he can't collect it. So it's a question. But if it's written on it, hold on one second. So the Rashbam says he doesn't collect until the orphans get older and he can bring them to court. So if he doesn't collect until they get older, and then they take an oath, and then he takes an oath and he collects from them. So, but if the lender wrote his kabalti mimcha, if the lender wrote, "I received your money from the guarantor," gova, then we're going to say that he's able to collect. So the Gemara says, "Bishlamo Rav Huna Breda Rav Yeshua." So this is actually, I introduced this as a question of Rav Huna Breda Rav Yeshua. That was wrong. There's a question of Rav Papa. So the Gemara says, "Bishlamo," makes sense according to Rav Huna Breda Rav Yeshua that he has to pay under these circumstances. It makes sense. That when do we say this case? When do we say when do we say this halacha? When the person who the father admitted that he owed the money and he didn't pay his debt, and therefore the heirs have to pay it to the lender, and so therefore, since he has a proof that he paid their father's debt, they have to pay him. But according to Rav Papa, who says that the orphans don't have to pay until they get older because it's a mitzvah, and only when they get older do they have to pay. Then how does he deal with this? The Gemara says, no, Shani Hasan. Rav Papa would say, or Rav Papa Kasha. So the Gemara says, Shani Hasan. No, this case is different, where the lender writes in a document that the guarantor paid. That's specifically why he wrote his kabalti, because then it's no longer going to be considered like it's an oral loan. He has a document, and if it's a loan by a document, Rav Papa would admit that we collect from the orphans because we don't say it's a mitzvah, but there we say it's a chov, it's an obligation upon them to pay the written documents, and that's why he has this written document against the estate. The Gemara says, Amarei. Ahu Arva, there was a guarantor, the Ove Kochavim. There's a guarantor for a loan to an idolater, from an idolater. Depari Ove Kochavim, and he paid off the idolater, Mikmedo et Benul Yasmin, before the idolater made the claim against the orphans. Amar Rav Mordechai Ravashi, Amar Avini, Me'agorni Mishmei Derabba, even according to Rabbi Huna Bar Yeshua says orphans don't have to pay back because maybe their father paid. Hani Mili Yisrael. That's by a Jew of all the chavim by an idolater. Given the Batzar Arvas, the idolaters go straight to the guarantor. We saw that Dina de Parsai, they go straight to the guarantor, the Persian laws. Therefore, therefore, they wouldn't be able to go straight to the guarantor if they had been given this like collateralized money. And so therefore the orphans would have to pay. So Amrulay Adarabba, just the opposite. So Ravashi responds just the opposite. Even according to our Papa, who says we're not concerned that the father paid it off. But Hani Mili Yisrael, that's a Jew of all de Kochavim, but idolater, given to Dainyanu Basar Arba, since those judges go straight to the guarantor, their laws go straight to the guarantor. He loved Adfasate Sorari Meikara. We're not for the fact that the father gave like a collateral that he gave the money at the beginning. So therefore, under these circumstances, the guy wouldn't have agreed to be the guarantor. So we assume in this case that he was paid off, and so the guarantor should not have paid. Also, we had this case in the Mishnah that the Mishnah had said, Rav Shmuel said, if somebody guarantors a person's guarantors the ksuba, a man gives a ksuba to a woman. He promised her a ksuba, but somebody has to guarantor because the groom has no money, and her husband divorces her. Then, under those circumstances, the Mishnah says that they have to take an oath against each other because we're worried that the man is going to pay the guarantor will pay the woman, and then the woman will just be using this as a way to get money, and then she'll remarry the husband, and then they tricked the guarantor. So therefore, we say that's what Rashbag says. So the Gemara says, so this prevents them from remarrying because they take an oath against each other. So therefore, they can't do this trick. Moshe Bar Atri Arva de Ksuvasa de Kawase Ave. Moshe Bar Atri was the guarantor for his daughter-in-law's ksuva. So Ravuna Bere, the Kawase Ave, Ravuna Bere, and his son Ravuna was Torah made the Rabbanan Ave. He was a young Torah scholar, and he was very poor. So Amar Abaya Leika Denezo Denaspi Eitza Ravuna the Nigrasho de Beisahu. The tays of a digve ksuva me'avua. So Abaye was shocked. He says, "Is there nobody's going to give advice to Rav Huna? And what he should do is he should divorce his wife, and then we should go collect, and then she'll go and collect the ksuva from his father. He'll get all the money. He'll have to give the money. And then he'll remarry her. And then Rav Huna will remarry her. And this way they'll have money." So the Gemara says, so Rava says to Abaye, he's shocked. But then we learn in the Mishnah that if they do that, they have to take a vow that they basically can't have benefit from each other. They can't remarry. Abaye ought to call them megarish, but Dina megarish. You think that whenever you get divorced, you have to get divorced in a court? Now, this is a controversial idea because perhaps you do have to get divorced in a court. So some want to say, so the Gemara explains, and Tosfos says, "Atu," that meaning to say, it seems to imply that you could get divorced without a court. But Rabbeinu Gershom says, no, it doesn't mean you get divorced without a court at all. It means that you get divorced in like a small court that they don't know what they're doing. So he says, get her divorced in a court that they don't know what they're doing, and so that then they won't be required to take this vow. With Soph, in the end, you go in Milsa the Kohen who it was discovered that Rav Huna, the son of Moshe, was a Kohen, so he wouldn't be able to do this legal maneuver anyway, because he wouldn't be able to remarry her. So Amar Abaye, I know this is what people say, Basar Aniya Azlani Yusa. The poor get poorer. After a poor man goes more poverty, but he can't get out of it this way. Mara says, Amar Abaye, does Abaye really say this? Amar Abaye, Ezu Rasha Aron. Did Abaye really give this person this advice? Didn't Abaye say, who's a wicked person? We had this earlier in our tractate back on Kuf Lamed Zayin on 137. Abaye said, it seems like it was yesterday, but it was almost 40 days ago. Abaye says, who is a wicked person who's crafty? Zeh Mesi Atzma Eitzel Korban Achasim Shimon Gamliel. So who's a wicked, crafty person? This who is the person who gives advice to sell the assets like Rav Shimon Gamliel. What's this referring to? The Gemara had said back in Kufa Ahmed Zion, this is the person who gets involved in this fight that's not his, and he undermines the intent of the giver who said, "My possessions are to you. I'm giving my assets to you, and after you, I'm giving them to another person." And it was his intent that the first person wouldn't sell it to others because he went to the person after you're done with it to go to the other person. And nevertheless, this guy goes and says, "Yeah, but you could sell it, and then it won't go to the next person." This person is called crafty because he's successful and it's a valid sale. And this is like Rav Shpag and says, if he sold it, it's valid sale. And, and so therefore, because the second person only gets what the first guy left behind. So Abai says such a person who gives this advice about how you could trick out the other person is called a Rasha Aru. So if that's the case, why is he telling Rav Huna, the son of Moshe, to do this? Gemara says, well, Abai was sympathetic here because Benot Shani, because he was his son, and he felt like this father should have been helping him out. Also, Tzurba Me Rabbanan Shani. Also, he was different because he was a Torah scholar. Abai felt that he should have been supported. Gemara says, wait, we have a different problem. He was a guarantor. So Moshe Bar Atzari was a guarantor for a ksuba, and we say that a guarantor for a ksuba doesn't work because we'll see that we suspect that the guy wasn't really full-throated in his guarantee of the ksuba. Arav the ksuba lo mishtabed. So the Gemara says no, kablanu. He was a different type. He was a higher level of guarantor. He was an Arav kablan. Gemara says hani chamanda amar kablan the ksuba. That only works going to position that even though you this works according to the one who says that if you say I'm going to be a kabbalah for the ksuba, this higher level of guarantor, even though the husband has no assets, you're really obligating yourself. According to the one who says even if you say I'm going to be a kabbalah, if the husband has no assets, you're really not obligating yourself because it's not a real full commitment. Michael Maimar. So what will we say? So Gemara says, either you could say the husband initially had assets, Rafuna had assets, and he lost them. The father, with respect to his son, he's really obligating himself. Because and how do we know that you can't be a guarantor for a ksuba? Because we're going to the Braitza. A guarantor for a ksuba, everybody's of the position, is not really obligating himself. A kabbalah de balchov, a kabbalah, a guarantor for a debt, everybody says you are obligating yourself. Kabbalah de ksuba, v'arv de balchov. Let's say you're just a kabbalah for a ksuba, or you're a kabbalah but for a ksuba, or you're a guarantor for a creditor. So that's a dispute. One says if he has assets, if the borrower has assets, then he's obligating himself. Otherwise, he's not. And one is of the position whether he has or whether he doesn't have, he's obligating himself. The hilchos and the halacha is, how do we rule? Arev bein islay bein leislay mishtabed, a guarantor. Whether the person has assets or not, you're obligating yourself. Bar mi arev diksuba, except for a ksuba. The alphagav the islay labal, even though the husband has assets, lo mishtabed. We don't really believe you're obligating yourself. My taima mitzvah David, because he assumes he's just doing a mitzvah. What is it? He's helping them get married, and so therefore he just says, "I'll say anything to let them get married," and he says they'll be happy. And the woman's not losing anything because we have a concept. Tav l'meitav ta'andumi l'meitav armu. The woman prefers to be married than to live by herself. So he's not costing her anything. So we don't trust the commitment to being the guarantor under those circumstances. All right, this is today's daf, and we'll stop here. A big shkayach.